I'm Aguirregomozcorta. I'm a consultant neurologist, lifestyle medicine physician, and I'm really passionate about how food, and in particular plant-based diets, can really help with our health. And today, I'm going to talk about how food impacts our mental health. And this is a topic that is quite often overlooked when we talk about food and health. We are mainly focused on physical health, so this topic is very fascinating, and I'm going to share that with you. So, okay, today we are going to start to talk about what is mental health and what is the current situation worldwide and in the UK, and then I will cover what do we need to eat for an optimal mental well-being, and finally, I'll talk about what we know about how food impacts the risk, and also whether we can use food therapeutically to treat or help with the treatment of mental health, and in particular depression, because most of the studies have been done with this condition. So the World Health Organization defines mental health not only as an absence of illness, but as a state of well-being in which an individual realizes their own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make contribution to their community. So there are these four main areas within our mental well-being that needs to be fulfilled in order to have optimal mental health. So we need to have positive relationships and have a sense of belonging in a community. We also need to have the appropriate cognitive skills to really have a feeling that we are we're productive and that we are doing something we enjoy and that is useful in life. We also need to build resilience to be able to cope with whatever we face in life. And actually, in the current situation within the world, we really need this foundational resilience to really do our best to live in this world, really. And then finally, we need our good deal of positive emotions and a sense of purpose to really have an optimal mental well-being. So this slide is mainly to give a bit of context, because there are many, many factors that can have an impact on our mental health. And diet and food is just one of them. However, this is very important. From my point of view, diet is foundational. It's going to set the foundations for a healthy life, including the mental area. However, it's not the only one that can contribute to that. And it's often very overlooked. So it's good that we have talks like today that we can share this knowledge. So what's the current situation? So worldwide, nearly 1 billion people live with a mental disorder. And most of these they come from depression and anxiety. And from the pandemic, the estimates are that these numbers have very likely gone up by more than 25%. So in the UK, the situation does not look much better. So 1 in 4 people will experience a mental health problem within a year. 1 in 15 will attempt suicide over their lifetime. 1 in 10 children lives with a mental problem. And depression is the third cause of disability in this country. So there is a lot to do in that regard. And I think that a shift in how we think and what we eat really can make a difference. So coming back to these 4 areas, now we'll go one by one and see what we can do in terms of food. I can summarize this talk And the message that I want to communicate today in one sentence, it's going to be eat more fruits and veggies. So that's it. The second one that will come in a minute is eat whole grains to boost your serotonin, but that's going to come in a minute. So for now, we are going to talk about fruits and veggies. So high intakes of fruits and veggies, and this is beyond 5 a day. So we are talking about 7, 8 servings a day have been associated with higher levels of happiness, life satisfaction, optimism, positive emotions, vitality, and engagement, meaning, and purpose in life. And the good thing with fruits and vegetables is that the effects are really quick. So studies have shown when they have seen and they have followed a few people for a few weeks, and they have asked what they eat and how they feel, they have found that the days they eat the more fruits and veggies, they feel better. And these effects do not stay only on that day, but the following day, they still are feeling better from the fruits and veggies that they ate the day before. So the recommendation will be to eat high fruits and veggies every day. And yeah, that's something very simple and that can really help with our mood. So can food help with our cognitive skills and productivity? The answer is yes. So studies have shown that plant-predominant diets are associated with better memory and cognitive function over time. And again, high intakes of fruits and vegetables are also linked with curiosity and creativity. So this is a really nice study by the Barnard group, where they took more than 100 employees from an insurance company, and they divide them into groups. So in one group, they asked them to follow a low-fat vegan diet, and they gave them regular sessions to help them with that. And in the other group, they had no instruction at all. And they looked at many other things and in terms of physical health, but in terms of the mental health, what they saw is that after 22 weeks, their mental health had improved and they were feeling much more productive. And I think there was a rate about, they reported that they had a 40% less errors regarding of productivity. Here we are. This is our friend, the serotonin, and this is how carbs are going to help with our mental health. So serotonin is the happy hormone, and it boosts our mood, it increases our sense of well-being, and it enhances social behavior. So what is important in terms of food and serotonin is that to produce serotonin, we do it from tryptophan. And tryptophan is an amino acid that is widely available in many foods. And you can find tryptophan in animal products and in plant foods. However, not all foods containing tryptophan are the same. And because the main function of tryptophan is to produce serotonin. So when you consume foods who have tryptophan, and they are also carbohydrate rich, and those are plants, you find that this tryptophan easily converts to serotonin. So we have much more serotonin in our brains, and that equals to having better mood and better mental health. And this does not happen with protein-rich products. So here, people who advocate, now low-carb diets are very popular. So people who advocate for a low-carb diet, certainly they have not read, this study, and certainly low-carb diets are not going to contribute to happiness. Now moving on to resilience. Resilience is very linked to our stress response. So here we have this diagram of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that is the one in charge of how we respond to stress. So here we have the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus releases this hormone, CHR, and this hormone comes to activate the pituitary to release the ACTH, that in turn it goes to the adrenal gland here on top of the kidneys, and it releases the cortisol, which then goes into the bloodstream, and then it does its function. So we want to have the right amounts of cortisol into the body in order to feel awake, alert, to be able to work, to do things, and to react when needed. But we don't want this to be overstimulated, because too much cortisol make us much more susceptible to stress and its effects. And this can lead to anxiety. And in turn, that will make us much less resilient. So this pathway, the function is to respond to whichever threat or situation we face, and also to adapt to our environment. But we don't want that, we want it to work appropriately, and we don't want that overactivated. So what happens in terms of food, and what do we know? So diets which are high in saturated fat and animal protein create a lot of inflammation in our body. And these inflammatory chemicals go and stimulate this pathway. And when this pathway, again, is overstimulated, that makes us more susceptible to stress. And plant-based diet reduces the inflammation in the body and has the opposite effect. So here, I want to stress that diet, and eating a healthy diet, is not going to make all our problems and troubles and the situation that we face nowadays in the world go away. However, it's going to make us stronger and more resilient to be able to cope and to be able to face and to be able to find solutions when possible, to really help ourselves and help others in the best possible way. And also, in the meantime, it will increase our creativity, so we may be more creative to find new ways for that. So now we'll move on to the second part of the talk, and this is about how food relates to mental illness. And in particular, it's going to be very focused on depression, but it's because this is the condition that has been most studied, and at least in the field of nutrition, and we know more about it. So, consistently, a study after a study, when they have looked at diets and or which foods causes or prevents depression, we found the same pattern. So there are mainly two patterns. So the healthy one, so people who eat a lot of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, and here remember the serotonin. So one of the reasons why whole grains really score really high in terms of preventing mental illness, it's very likely because it boosts our serotonin levels in the brain. So people eating high fruits, vegetables, whole grains, including legumes and nuts in the diet, and including fish, have been found to decrease the risk of depression. And I'm going to talk about fish in a few slides. And on the contrary, a Western pattern, so high in red and processed meat, high in dairy and processed foods, increases the risk of depression. And this is something that pretty much everyone agrees. It has been found the same in many different studies and across many different populations. So the next step that these researchers wondered was like, okay, food has an impact on the risk to develop mental illness, but can food actually be used therapeutically to treat depression? So they developed this randomized control trial. So they got 67 people with major depression and a poor dietary quality, and they defined poor dietary quality as a low intake of fiber and plants, and a high intake of sweets, processed meats, and salty snacks. And then they divide them in two groups. So in one of them, for 12 weeks, they provide them with nutritional counseling about what they call the modified Mediterranean diet. And this is what they recommended. So they recommended a high amount of whole grains, between 5 and 8 servings a day, vegetables 6 servings a day, fruit 3 servings a day, then legumes, nuts, and a bit of olive oil. This was not 100% plant-based, so they also recommended moderate amounts of fish, low-fat dairy, and moderate amounts of meat and eggs. So what they found after 2 weeks is that the group that had improved the quality of their diet, they had greater improvement in their depression, and this is very, very significant. 1/3 of them went into remission. So the symptoms of depression completely went away. And that's quite striking. So this has been a small study. Larger studies are needed, but improving the quality of our diets is something that everyone can do. And I bet that if that would have been a whole food plant-based diet, probably the results would have been even better. So what are the mechanisms that cause or that have been associated with depression, and how food relates to that? So mainly we have 4. We have inflammation, oxidative stress that Dr. Adibo before talked about. We have impaired neuroplasticity, and we have altered gut microbiota. So let's start with inflammation. Inflammation, it has a very bad press, but actually it's very important for our survival. So inflammation is the process by which our body repairs itself after injury and also protects us from infection. So our body, or inflammation, is designed to really be acute and to be there when an injury happens, and when everything is healed and repaired, then go away. However, what happens nowadays is that this inflammation has chronified, and this is what leads us to many chronic diseases. Today we already talked about cardiovascular disease and many other chronic diseases in the first talk, and underlying all them, there is chronic inflammation. So mental illness is no different than that. So what are the contributing factors to this chronic inflammation? So they are all lifestyle related, and it's mainly psychological stress, smoking, obesity, lack of sleep, and the focus of today, poor diet. So what happens when our inflammatory system and pathway is chronically activated? So in this case, our immune system is overactivated too, and the immune system produces these inflammatory chemicals that we call cytokines, and these chemicals go and activate the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic branch, which is the one that is in charge of the fight or flight response. The stress pathway that we talked before, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal pathway, so we have higher cortisol in our blood, and very related to depression and other mental illness. When we have this chronic inflammation, there is a higher breakdown of these important neurotransmitters, so serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin, so they are less available in the brain. So, is food associated with that? So the answer is yes. And again, you'll see that the same pattern gets repeated over and over again within this talk. So saturated fat, acid arachidonic, that is one omega-6, and refined starches are contribute to inflammation by activating pro-inflammatory chemicals, while plant-based diet, again, help with that and reduces inflammation in our body. So let's talk now about fish and omega-3 fatty acids. So what the research has found is that people who eat meat, the consumption of fish reduces the risk of depression. And this is because by consuming fish, that reduces the omega-6 and the omega-3 ratio. In particularly, it reduces the arachidonic acid and EPA ratio. And let's see how this works. So this is a very simplified diagram of these pathways, which are a bit more complex than that. But to give you an idea on how this works. So we have the first compounds of these both pathways. So the omega-6 pathways, which is the pro-inflammatory pathway, we have here the linolenic acid. And in the omega-3 pathway, which is the anti-inflammatory pathway, we have the alpha-linolenic acid. So both of them are essential. That means that our body does not produce them, and therefore we need to get them from our food. So there are a few reactions in between there, but at the end of this, linolenic acid is converted into arachidonic acid. And that's the one that switches on the inflammatory cascades in our body. Okay? Then, in the omega-3 pathway, again, we have several reactions here. And at the end, alpha-linolenic acid is converted into EPA and DHA. And those are the ones that activate the anti-inflammatory pathway and release all these anti-inflammatory compounds. So what happened in our modern society? So in our modern society, we have too much sources of omega-6. And we have a few extra sources of the linolenic acid in the form of vegetable oils, animal fats, and processed foods. However, when we intake an excess of the linolenic acid, our body still has some capacity to really modulate this pathway, so not that much acid arachidonic is formed. However, the problem comes that animal foods are filled with arachidonic acid. So when we take this preformed arachidonic acid, our body has no way to modulate that. So they will activate all this cascade, and all these inflammatory chemicals will go into our blood and cause the harm that we've mentioned before. So in this situation, what compensates all this inflammatory cascade by inhibiting the arachidonic acid is EPA. So this is why we need higher amounts of EPA to really compensate the amount of arachidonic acid that we are taking. And this is why people who are eating animal products, when they eat fish, they are better off and they have better outcomes. But what happens when we take all animal products from our plate and, if possible, and even better, the vegetable oils and the processed foods? So that means that these two pathways come back to balance. So the right balance is a ratio of 2:1. So that means that we consume linolenic acid from the natural sources, nuts, seeds, and soy, and then our body converts that to the arachidonic acid that we need. And the alpha-linolenic acid that there is plenty in flax, chia, hemp, walnuts, and in lesser amounts in other plants, then also is converted to EPA and DHA. And these amounts should be enough because we don't need that much to compensate because we don't have any excess of arachidonic acid. So, have there been any research or any studies in actually looking at what happened when people follow a vegetarian diet versus an omnivore or fish diet? So these researchers, they took 138 people from the Seventh-day Adventists, and they look at their diets, and they asked them to fill some scales about depression, anxiety, and their mood. So they found that there were 78 omnivores, and in normal standards, those will be considered healthy omnivores because most of them were eating fish. And then there were 60 vegetarians. And when they look at the intakes, they saw that the vegetarians had lower intake of the EPA, DHA, and arachidonic acids, and higher intake of the alpha-linolenic acid and the linolenic acid. And they found that the vegetarians had better mood. So the conclusion was that very likely the consumption of EPA and DHA was not as important as the ratio between the omega-6 and the omega-3. So they wanted to go a step further. So then in this study, they took 39 people with an omnivore diet, and they divide them in 3. So a third of them, there was no change. They were eating meat, fish, or poultry daily. 13 of them, they asked them to avoid meat and poultry and to increase the amounts of fish. And then in 13 of them, they asked them to avoid meat, fish, poultry, and eggs. And after 2 weeks, they were very compliant with the diets, and they found that in the omnivore group, there was no change in the omega-6, omega-3 ratio, and also no change in their mood. In the fish, they found that they had very much increased the intake of EPA and DHA. However, they did not find any change in the mood either. However, in the vegetarian group, they reduced the 3 of them, the EPA, DHA, and arachidonic acid, and they improved the mood. So the conclusion, again, that was confirming in a way what they have found in the previous study, that very likely it's not that much the absolute amount of omega-3, but the ratio with the amount of omega-6 that people consume. So moving to the second underlying mechanism that contributes to mental illness and depression, so oxidative stress. So Dr. Adibo has already talked about that. So oxidative stress is an imbalance between the production of free radicals, and free radicals are toxic chemicals that happen after normal metabolic reactions that happen in our body, and the body's ability to counteract that. And this is called antioxidant defense. So we are very familiar with antioxidants. Fruits and vegetables are very abundant in antioxidants, and this is one of the reasons why they improve our health. And these antioxidant compounds really offer protection of our neurons and our brains and reduce the neuronal damage due to oxidative stress. So what we know about people with mental illness? So studies have found that people with mental illness tend to have higher levels of free radicals in the blood and lower levels of antioxidants. So the third underlying mechanism is impaired neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is the ability of our brain to change and adapt over time. And for our brain to be able to change and adapt over time, two things need to happen. Our brain needs to be able to create new connections between the neurons, which is called synaptogenesis, and it needs to be able to create new neurons, which is called neurogenesis. And the BDNF, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, it's a very important chemical and compound that really ensures that this happens. So many of you may have heard that neurons are one of the few cells in our body that cannot be replaced. So, and I mean, that was what we thought that happened until a few years ago, that it was discovered that actually in the adult brain, there are two areas in the brain that still have the capacity to produce and to create new neurons. So, and one of them is the hippocampus. And that's important in mental illness because it regulates mood. So it's involved in learning, and it's involved in memory, and also in mood regulation. And this is one of the two areas in the adult human brain where we can create new neurons. So we have found that people with mental illness have an alteration in the neurogenesis capacity, and also consistent with that, people with mental illness tend to have lower levels of this chemical in the blood. And also, and this is quite reassuring, there's been a few interventions where people with either schizophrenia or depression have been asked either to consume more fruits and veggies, about 8 servings a day, or to follow more plant-predominant diets. And in both cases, they have found that the BDNF has increased in their blood. So suggesting that that improves the neurogenesis capacity of our brain. Also quite striking and quite important to bear in mind, in healthy adults, a single meal rich in fat decreases the BDNF in blood by 30%. So, I mean, if this is a one-off, our body very likely will recover from that, and the levels will come up again. However, if, as this happens, quite concerning in our modern society, people eat high-fat meal after high-fat meal after high-fat meal, that will mean that very likely people will end up having far less brain-derived neurotrophic factor to really create new connections and create new neurons in our brain. Also, and this was also quite interesting a study, so they took few people and they looked at their diets, and they looked at the size of their hippocampus with a brain MRI. And they followed them, and they had another MRI after 4 years. So what they found is that people with a poor diet, which was defined by high intakes of meat and processed food, had a smaller hippocampus. So, and that's quite important. In fact, people with depression have also been found to have a smaller hippocampus in the imaging studies. But those many of them were healthy people. So, yeah, the question is whether this will put them at a higher risk of developing depression or other brain conditions like Alzheimer's, but that study did not go that far. So the final mechanism that has been found to be involved in the development of depression is our gut microbiota. So gut microbiota is the community of microorganisms that live in our gut. And this is a growing field, and there is still a lot that we don't know and we don't understand about how this functions, about the microbiota relationship with the brain. So what we know is that there is this complex bidirectional communication between them, and that this happens either by chemicals that are released in the blood or by activation of several neural pathways. And we also know that the microbiota in our gut modulate the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the one that we just said that was involved in brain plasticity. It's also involved in the serotonin neurotransmission. It's involved in our immune function, and it also has a role in our stress response. So because of all these mechanisms, the gut microbiota actually regulate our stress and how we respond to stress, the anxiety, cognition, and social interaction. And we've also found that people who have an imbalance in this gut microbiota, and this is what we call dysbiosis, they have more risk of develop depression and anxiety. So we've also found that people with depression have a decreased gut microbiota diversity and an increased gut permeability, or what is called leaky gut. And these two images here represent what happens in a normal gut and in a gut where the permeability is increased. And this is what happens. So these cells represent the lining of the gut, and these cells are very tight together and by what we call tight junctions. So all the microbiota and all the compounds and chemicals that these microbiota release stay here in the gut, and only the ones that are selected can go through the lining to the blood. However, when these junctions are a bit loose, what happens is that all these compounds and even the microorganisms themselves can go through these spaces into the bloodstream. And then there is when they cause harm. So increased gut permeability activates the immune cells in the gut wall, and that creates inflammation. So when we talk about food, again, we see the same pattern. So saturated fat and animal protein contribute to increase gut permeability, to shift the type of microorganisms to more inflammatory ones, and also animal protein has been associated with the bacteria that are also seen in people with depression. On the other hand, plant-based diet is plenty of fiber and fiber is the preferred food of our gut microbiota, and it really feeds the good guys. So, to end, what shall we eat for optimal mental well-being? So the answer is a whole food plant-based diet, and we shall aim for at least 7 servings of fruits and veggies a day. Make sure you have your whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds. Remember the omega-3 rich foods, chia and flax, and also it's important to have a vitamin B supplement. And with that will reduce our risk of depression. That will help us better function in the world. That will also promote our connection to others and help us cope with whatever we face in life and thrive. Thrive. So I would like to finish with this quote of Dr. Michael Greger: we should all be eating fruits and veggies as if our lives depend on it. Because, in fact, it actually does. So thank you very much.